Today, I want to talk about the most expensive government in history, both in cost of wealth and in cost of life and suffering. If you've been paying attention to the discourse around China and its place in the global order, you've probably encountered one of two narratives. Either China is an unstoppable rising superpower destined to dominate the 21st century, or the camp that I more accurately fall into, that modern China is a brittle, over-leveraged system stumbling towards some kind of collapse. But both these framings are still pretty black and white. I have a slightly more nuanced view on China's future, even if I have full certainty in the current communist system failing. I want to talk about not what China is doing, but what the Chinese people are capable of when their state and political system get out of the way. Because the answer to that question is already sitting right in front of us, fully visible and extensively documented, and almost never talked about with the seriousness it deserves. The answer is that Chinese people operating under free systems with access to capital markets, rule of law, and competitive economies are among the most economically formidable people on earth. They do not just succeed, they dominate. They accumulate wealth, build institutions, and generate influence at a rate that puts most other ethnic and cultural groups to shame. And the only thing that has ever meaningfully slowed them down is their own government. Let's start with the diaspora, because the diaspora tells you everything you need to know about the Chinese people's potential. Singapore is the clearest possible case study. The country is approximately 74% ethnically Chinese. Its GDP per capita sits at roughly 107,000 US dollars. That is much higher than the United States, Germany, Japan, and the United Kingdom. Only 5 countries are estimated globally to have GDP per capitas over $100,000. A city-state with almost no natural resources, no agricultural land, and no strategic depth has produced one of the wealthiest populations on Earth in the span of roughly 2 generations. The mechanism was not magic, it was property rights, rule of law, open trade, and a government that understood that its job was to facilitate wealth creation rather than control it. Capitalism. Taiwan tells a similar story. Separated from the mainland since 1949, the Taiwanese economy underwent a transformation that the mainland is still struggling to replicate. Taiwan today has a GDP per capita of roughly 35,000 USD and rising, more than 3 times higher than the mainland. A semiconductor industry that controls the most critical choke point in the entire global technology supply chain, and a standard of living that dwarfs the mainland in virtually every meaningful metric. Taiwan did not get here because it had better geography or more natural resources. Quite the opposite. It got here because its economic system allowed Chinese talent, entrepreneurship, and ambition to actually compound over time. Capitalism. Then look at Chinese Americans. According to census data, Chinese Americans have a median household income that exceeds the national American average. They are disproportionately represented in elite universities, in technology firms, in finance, in medicine, in academia. The pattern holds regardless of generation. The first generation immigrants arrive and build. Second generation inherits and expands. The compounding never stops as long as the system around them does not interfere with it. And this is not limited to 1 or 2 countries. Southeast Asian Chinese communities across Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and the Philippines have, for generations, controlled economic activity disproportionate to their share of the population. The overseas Chinese, numbering somewhere around 60 million people globally, generate economic output that rivals the GDP of entire major nations. A relatively small population scattered across dozens of countries, with no unified state backing them, has quietly built one of the most remarkable economic track records in modern history. The question you have to ask is this: if 60 million overseas Chinese can accomplish all of that without the People's Republic of China doing anything for them, what could 1.4 billion mainland Chinese accomplish if the system governing them was not actively working against their interests? The cost of communism. Now, let's actually quantify what the Communist Party has cost the Chinese people, because this is not an abstraction. This is a ledger, and the numbers are staggering. The Great Leap Forward, launched in 1958, attempted to rapidly transform China into a socialist industrial state through forced collectivization and centrally planned production quotas. The result was the deadliest famine in recorded human history. Estimates of excess deaths range from 25 to 50 million people dead, depending on the methodology used. Entire regions were stripped of agricultural output to meet quotas that had no relationship to actual productive capacity. People starved while grain was being exported to demonstrate ideological success. This was not a natural disaster. It was an entirely man-made catastrophe, produced by a system that valued political conformity over human outcomes. The Cultural Revolution, running from 1966 to 1967, then systematically destroyed the educated class. Universities were closed, intellectuals were sent to labor camps, professionals were humiliated, imprisoned, or killed. An entire generation of Chinese human capital was deliberately dismantled because an educated population capable of independent thought was perceived as a threat to the party. Think about what that means in terms of compounding. The wealthiest, most sophisticated economies in the world have spent decades accumulating institutional knowledge, scientific expertise, and financial sophistication across generations. China spent a decade deliberately destroying exactly that kind of generational accumulation. The damage was not just immediate, it was structural, and it echoed forward through decades of delayed development. Even after the reform and opening up era beginning in 1978, which produced the genuine economic gains China experienced through the 90s and 2000s, the party never actually relinquished control. It permitted capitalism within a cage. Entrepreneurs could build, but only so far. Companies could grow, but they remained ultimately accountable to party priorities rather than market logic. The result was a system that captured some of the gains of liberalization while insulating the political class from accountability for its failures. If it were not for the Chinese Communist Party and their strangulation of the Chinese people for nearly a century, China today would easily be the largest economy on earth, and its people the most wealthy and powerfully globally. The firewall as a civilizational handicap. Now, let's talk about something that does not get nearly enough attention in economic analysis of China. The Great Firewall is not just a censorship tool. It is a civilizational handicap, and its costs run deeper than most people appreciate. The open internet, for all its chaos and dysfunction, is the most powerful knowledge distribution system ever created. It is where scientific papers circulate, where business models are stress tested, where ideas cross-pollinate across disciplines and geographies, where capital finds opportunities and opportunities find capital. Access to that system, genuine unfettered access, is an economic advantage in the same category as access to a deep water port or a functioning legal system. Chinese mainland internet users do not have that access. Google, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, Wikipedia, all blocked. Instead, they operate within an insulated domestic ecosystem that is in many ways technically sophisticated, but fundamentally a closed echo chamber. Weibo instead of Twitter, Baidu instead of Google. Domestic platforms that are optimized not just for engagement, but for compliance with political requirements, and mandated to be propaganda arms of the regime. What this means in practice is that an entire generation of mainland Chinese talent is being trained in a closed intellectual environment. They are not reading the same papers, engaging with the same debates, or building on the same open source foundations as their peers in Taiwan, Singapore, and the United States. Some of the best ones leave, and the brain drain statistics reflect this. Others adapt and build genuinely impressive things within the constraints they are given. But the constraint itself is real, it is large, and it compounds over time in the wrong direction. And then there is the self-censorship layer, which is arguably more damaging than the direct censorship. When people know that certain thoughts, certain questions, certain lines of inquiry will attract attention from a surveillance apparatus, they stop having those thoughts publicly, and eventually, in many cases, they stop having them at all. Innovation requires asking uncomfortable questions. It requires the freedom to be wrong in public, to challenge perceived wisdom, to disagree with authority. A system that punishes that kind of thinking does not just suppress political dissent, it suppresses the cognitive habits that produce economic and technological breakthroughs. This can be demonstrated obviously with the massive gap in global soft power between 1.4 billion Chinese versus just 50 million Koreans. The Chinese are not allowed to compete for influence in the global attention economy, therefore they get dominated culturally by small nations like Korea and Japan. What happens when the cage opens? So let's now think seriously about the scenario that is underway in slow motion and will eventually accelerate. What happens when the system breaks, when the firewall comes down, when the party loses its grip like all regimes in China do? When 1.4 billion people who have been operating inside a constrained system are suddenly connected to the full global economy and the open internet without restriction? Because the precedent for this is already documented. We watched it happen in a smaller version after 1978, when Deng Xiaoping cracked the cage open slightly. The result was the fastest large-scale economic expansion in recorded human history. Hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty in a matter of decades. An industrial machine that reshaped global supply chains, all of that from a partial, incomplete, heavily managed liberalization. A full liberalization is something that economic models are genuinely not designed to capture, because there is no real historical precedent for it at this scale. Now pair that with what the Chinese people have already demonstrated they can do with access to better systems. The overseas Chinese template is your best available data point. 60 million people outside the mainland, operating in free systems, generating extraordinary wealth and influence with no state support, and often in the face of active discrimination from host country majorities. Now multiply that template by 23. That is the rough ratio of mainland Chinese to overseas Chinese. And ask yourself honestly what that looks like when the barriers come down. Chinese mainland entrepreneurs are already, within the constraints of the current system, producing globally competitive technology companies. ByteDance built the most successful social media algorithm on Earth. Huawei, whatever your view on its relationship with the state, built a telecommunications infrastructure company that competed directly with the best the West had to offer and forced Western governments into a panic response. These are products of a partially liberated, heavily constrained system. The ceiling of what gets built when the constraints are removed is not something you can extrapolate linearly. The global internet moment. There is one more dimension to this that is almost never discussed. What happens when mainland Chinese users hit the open internet at scale? Right now, the global internet exists in a state where its dominant languages, cultures, and reference points are primarily English and Western. Chinese internet culture is enormous, sophisticated, and almost entirely invisible to the Western eye because of the firewall. When that barrier dissolves, you are not going to get a steady trickle of Chinese users joining the existing Western platforms and assimilating into existing norms. You are going to get a flood of hundreds of millions of users who have their own aesthetics, their own humor, their own intellectual traditions, their own consumer preferences, and their own capital to spend. The platforms, the content ecosystems, the e-commerce infrastructure, the financial products that serve that population, these will reshape what the global internet looks like in the same way that mobile internet reshaped what the internet looked like in the 2000s and 2010s. And the people who understand both the Chinese context and the global context are going to be positioned at the center of one of the largest economic transitions in history. This is not a forecast about some distant possible future. The conditions for this transformation are already building. The pressure on the current Chinese political system is intensifying from multiple directions simultaneously. The economic model that justified the social contract is degrading. The information environment inside China is increasingly difficult to control as VPN usage rises and foreign educated returnees bring external reference points back with them. And the generation that grew up with smartphones and global awareness is a fundamentally different political constituency than the generation that lived through the Cultural Revolution. Here's the actual conclusion. The most expensive government in human history is not the one that levied the highest taxes or ran the largest deficits. It is the one that took the most economically capable large population on Earth, put it inside a box, told it what to think, where to invest, and what to build, and led over 1 billion people off of a cliff, then called the partially suppressed output that resulted a miracle of communist governance. The miracle was never the ruling party, and it never is with a country's success. The miracle was the Chinese people, and the evidence for that is visible everywhere that Chinese people have been allowed to operate freely. When the box finally breaks, and the trajectory of every closed system in history suggests that it always does, the redistribution of talent, capital, and ambition into the open global economy will be the defining economic event of the next several decades. The release of the most consequential suppressed potential in the modern world. And the world is not remotely prepared for what that looks like. I believe a Chinese century is coming, but it won't be through the power of their state, and it will only come after the end of the communist regime.